Eliminating the PCAOB would risk the trust that we have in our capital markets and the fact that it allows companies to raise capital, create jobs at a low cost, and that we are the envy of the world. The trust that people have in our capital markets really does depend upon the quality of the audited financial statements.
Are you an accountant with a continuing education requirement? You can earn free NASBA-approved CPE for listening to this episode. Just visit earmark.app in your web browser, take a short quiz, and get your certificate. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Earmark. I'm Blake Oliver. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most significant regulatory battles facing our profession. The House of Representatives has passed legislation that would eliminate the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB, and transfer its functions to the SEC. This isn't just another regulatory tweak. It's a fundamental reshaping of audit oversight that could affect every public company audit in America. I'm joined today by three of the nation's leading accounting academics who have studied the PCAOB extensively. Maureen McNichols from Stanford is a leading researcher on capital markets and financial reporting quality and formerly served on the PCAOB's Standing Advisory Group. Maureen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Blake. It's just a privilege to be here.
We've also got Nemit Shroff from MIT, whose groundbreaking research demonstrates the real economic effects of PCAOB inspections on corporate financing and investment decisions. And Nemit currently serves on the Investor Advisory Group at the PCAOB. Nemit, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Blake. It's great to be here.
And finally, we've got Daniel Aobdia, currently at Penn State, who brings the unique perspective of having worked inside the PCAOB as a senior research fellow and has studied how individual engagement inspections actually drive audit quality improvements. Daniel, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Blake. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, Daniel and Nemit, I know that both of you are currently involved with the PCAOB, so let's go ahead and give that standard disclaimer right now at the top of the program.
I'm a member of the PCAOB's Investor Advisory Group, and anything I say is my own views and does not represent the views of the PCAOB or the IAG.
Thanks, Nemit. Daniel, anything to add to that?
Yes, so I used to work as a senior economic research fellow at the PCAOB, and I currently do some consulting for them on questions related to the economics of auditing. The views expressed here are my own, do not necessarily reflect the views of the board, individual board members, or staff of the PCAOB.
Got it. So the timing of this conversation couldn't be more critical. The PCAOB just reported record enforcement activity and improving audit quality metrics, but Congress is moving to eliminate it entirely as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which just passed the House by a single vote last week. So let's explore what the research tells us about the PCAOB's effectiveness, what would happen if it's eliminated, and whether this represents sound regulatory reform or political expedience. For our audience of accounting and tax professionals, this could fundamentally change how public company audits are overseen and regulated. So let's get started. Maureen, thank you for setting this up. First of all, I really appreciate you bringing together this group to answer some questions that I've had for a long time as an outsider watching the PCAOB over the past decade. The House passed this bill, which includes the PCAOB getting eliminated by a single vote. Maureen, are you surprised by how quickly this moved through Congress?
Before I answer that question, let me just also say, since you recognize that I brought this group together, I'm a big fan of the podcast. I feel like it's terrific, the community that you build for accountants. And I think we're all here because we believe in the work accountants do to contribute in so many different ways, in every role, creating economic growth and jobs for so many people. And so it's that passion for the work that accountants do that I think motivates us all to, do the teaching and research that we do. Okay, so now turning to the bill. Now that's a great question. I guess at some level, I was surprised, though. I think that it was certainly it's not my expertise, sort of the House budgetary process. It certainly is very concerning. The process, the fact that it went through so quickly, the fact that the legislation is like 1,000 pages and people really didn't get a chance. What did they get, 2 hours to read it or something like that? So, all of those dimensions, I think, and particularly HR 50002 are extremely concerning.
It did surprise me because I know there was talk about rolling the PCAOB back into the SEC or eliminating its role, but I didn't think it would happen this fast. I mean, I feel like those discussions just started a few months ago, or has this been going on for a while? Like is this sudden, or has this been happening behind the scenes?
Oh, for sure. There's been efforts behind the scenes. Project 2025, written last spring or sometime earlier, basically had as one of its goals to eliminate the PCAOB. So there's been an effort. There have been people wanting to achieve this and discussing it, to be sure, figuring out how it could be done. But in terms of the process, in the House, for sure, that's moved ahead very quickly, and it means many, many people did not get a chance to really process what this is about.
Oh, and can I just ask you, what is your take on this? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea?
I'll give an emphatic no. I think it's a bad idea to take out, an independent audit regulator, basically that was put in place by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was passed by, regular process, an overwhelming vote in the House and the Senate in support of it, with tremendous detail, 22 pages of details characterizing what the PCAOB, structure should be, how it should operate, what its responsibilities were, how it should relate to the SEC, what should happen with enforcement penalties, which is to actually fund a scholarship program. So there was incredible thought that went into how to address the problems that arose, in the early 2000s because of what is really an inherent structural problem in the auditing profession, which is, that companies, their audit committees hire the auditor to carry out the work. And so while the auditor's true client is the investing public, it is very easy, to lose sight of that. Agency issues, pressure, time, all of those factors can cause it to be very difficult to keep that focus. And so an independent audit regulator, is really there to give strength to the auditors, really, to support them.
I was just talking yesterday with a former auditor who now runs a technology company, Mike Whitmire of Flowcast. He was a senior at Ernst & Young before he left public accounting to go do tech. And I asked him, what do you think about this situation, the PCAOB? As an auditor yourself, were you aware of it? Did it impact your work? And he told me that, yes, they were afraid of the PCAOB, that it definitely was something on their mind at all times, that the work that they were doing might be inspected. And so he says, based on his experience, without that independent regulator looking over their shoulders or the possibility of it, that they might not have, I don't know if those were his words, but, I would think, yeah, maybe as an auditor, I'm not as diligent or there's not as much pressure on me to do a high quality audit. I'm curious what the research is to back up that, because I've heard this anecdotally from partners, folks who have worked in audit as, staff, managers, but I haven't really seen a lot in the way of research personally that quantifies the impact of the PCAOB. So I would love to know what that is. So can I start with you, Nemit? I know you've done a bunch of research on firms that get audited. If you have a clean PCAOB inspection report, there's definitely like a difference between that and if it's not clean. Can you walk me through your findings at a high level?
Absolutely. And before going there, even like if you just look at broader picture, just time trends of what has happened, has there been any major public company fraud since the creation of the PCAOB, since Sarbanes-Oxley? And not really, right? Like if the major frauds after WorldCom and Enron, there's not been a fraud of that scale in the US public markets for more than 2 decades. But the incentives to commit fraud and the incentives that give rise to those pressures, they've not gone away, right? And so where do we see the frauds now? And some of this is in the private markets, which is not regulated by the PCAOB or by the SEC, right? So like FTX, and WeWorks, and Theranos, these are prominent examples of instances where private companies have had fraud, and they are not watched. They don't have any the governance mechanisms that exist there just do not exist for private companies. So coming back to what to answer your specific question about what my research shows, the at a high level, what I tried to do is come up with a way to see whether if a company's auditor is inspected by the PCAOB, do they get any capital market benefits? Are they able to raise capital on more favorable terms? And are they then able to use that extra capital to increase investment decisions? The challenge of doing this in the US is that every company's auditor is inspected by the PCAOB, as long as they're public. So there are certain aspects of the way in which the PCAOB is structured, particularly their international inspection program, where I used instances where some companies' auditors were inspected by the PCAOB, whereas other companies that were similar in industry and scale and type, but their auditor was not inspected by the PCAOB. And what I find, and this shows up in the data very clearly, is that when a company's auditor is inspected by the PCAOB, if the content of that inspection report is clean, meaning there's no Part 1 finding, then that company is able to raise additional capital, and they use this additional capital to increase their investment.
Okay, so clean inspection, meaning the audit was done to a high quality. That correlates with companies that are able to raise more capital.
Correct. And what when I say clean, what it means is the challenge with auditing is that, as your audience probably knows, is we don't, as outsiders, we don't see much about what happens with the audit process. Right? What we get at the end of the audit process is a statement from the auditor saying whether the company sort of passed or failed, right? Whether there were any concerns or not. Nothing more than that. So what the inspection report does is that it paints a picture. It gives investors information about whether the auditor's general processes that they follow, whether they are reasonable, or were there issues that are identified by the PCAOB. The mechanism is not perfect. The system is not perfect, but this certainly provided more information, order of magnitude more information than what investors received about the audit processes beforehand. And I think that is what was relevant.
Okay, so basically that is sort of like an indirect way. I mean, since we can't measure it directly, of supporting this argument. I mean, it supports this idea that the PCAOB's oversight benefits capital markets.
Correct. Yes, this was a way to get at that question.
Got it. Yeah. So one of my concerns that I've expressed on my podcast about the PCAOB is and I learned this also from my interview with Christina Ho, who's a board member of the PCAOB, is that like the way the PCAOB measures audit quality may be fundamentally flawed, in that they do not randomly select audits for inspection. And because they don't randomly select audits for inspection, when we look at deficiency rates, we can't necessarily compare them from year to year or over time easily. Audits are selected for inspection based on unknown criteria. It's like a risk-based approach. And so when Christina told me that, it changed how I viewed this very high deficiency rate that's been advertised or shared in press releases for years, which approaches 50%. And for many firms is 100% of audits are deficient that are inspected. So I was wondering, Daniel, since you were inside the PCAOB as a research fellow, do you have a take on that? Like, could the PCAOB have done a better job, or could it do a better job measuring audit quality in a way that allows us to actually see that it has made an improvement? Like, because Nemit's research is so, like, that way of determining whether what the impact is feels very indirect, right? It's like, why can't we just measure this directly?
Right. So you mentioned a lot of very good points. So I just want to be clear that I am subject to a non-disclosure agreement with the PCAOB. So everything I will mention is based on publicly available information, just to be clear. That said, those are very good questions that you're asking. And it's interesting because I suspect internally the PCAOB themselves have struggled about how to highlight this deficiency rate over the years, because the deficiency rate itself that comes from the inspection is something that's been more highlighted by the popular press rather than the PCAOB themselves over the years. And for the exact reason you mentioned, that inspections are risk-based. So they are not meant to select a representative sample of audits for inspections. So if you look before 2010, the PCAOB did not even disclose the number of inspections they are doing for each of the big four firms. So you couldn't even compute that deficiency rate using publicly available data. They only started doing that, I believe, after 2010, and that's when popular press has started picking up on the deficiency rate. But the PCAOB has always been very transparent that because the inspections are risk-based, it is very difficult to extrapolate what's happening on this deficiency rate for other average typical engagements of an audit firm. And so,
Right.
in a way, it's very hard to actually understand what the true level of deficiency in a typical audit firm is. Also, I have to mention a little bit of my recent research on that. So since around 2016, 2017, the PCAOB has started inspecting some engagements on a random basis. On average, it's been around 20% of the engagements of the large audit firms that have been inspected randomly. And if actually you start digging in the PCAOB inspection reports, there's actually more information that is made available to the public about the deficiency rate for the random selections relative to the risk-based selections. And I think that's something that hasn't been highlighted at all even in research, I mean, except for one project I'm currently working on, but especially not in the popular press. And when you look at the numbers, and everything I'm going to mention here is based on publicly available information. So my co-authors and I have been finding that the random deficiency rate seems to be closer to 20% on average, rather than the risk-based deficiency rate for the large audit firms, which is closer to 30%. So I wanted to mention that because all of this information is actually publicly available in the report. If you look at a recent PCAOB inspection report of one of the largest audit firms, PCAOB will tell you how many inspections were conducted randomly, how many were conducted using a risk-based analysis. And if you actually read the text of the report, they will tell you how many deficiencies were risk-based deficiencies, and you can infer how many were random based on the total number and the risk-based deficiencies.
So you're saying that it's closer to 20%? The true deficiency rate?
So I'm looking at the average here that's been compiled by my co-authors that they've been digging through the inspection reports. And between 2018 and 2024, they have been able, based on publicly available versions of those reports, to understand how many Part 1 findings were random versus for random inspections versus for risk-based inspections. And the rate for the random ones is closer to 20%.
20%. That still seems very high. It feels like that's too high. If I'm taking a test, to get an A, I need to answer 90% or more of the questions correctly, right? As a profession, do we really want to be getting a, B- or a C+?
If I may say something, so I understand the concern, and especially in the United States, people look at an 80% pass rate as being very low. Where I grew up in France, I would have been really, really happy if I got 80% on a test. So I think it's in part related with the expectations that people have. But that said, I mean, the deficiency rate is probably quite high. I think we would be happy to discuss what potentially could be driving this high deficiency rate. But we have to keep in mind that the instances where there's actually a mistake in the financial statement, where eventually there's a misstatement, are going to be likely lower than this deficiency rate, because you will only find a misstatement in a financial statement of an issuer only when the financial statements have a misstatement to begin with and the auditor fails to catch those misstatements. So a very high deficiency rate doesn't necessarily imply that 20% of companies' financial statement will need to be restated in the future.
And that was something that Christina Ho pointed out in my interview with her, which is that the restatement rate is something like 5% or lower. So is that right?
It goes up to about, I think in more recent years, when the SPAC boom took place, it was about 12%.
Okay, but the SPACs are another story, right? We could leave that out of it for now, right? That's kind of an unusual situation.
Closer to about 4% in the very last year. Audit Analytics put out the data.
Got it. So, see, that's the thing that I think is hard for me to wrap my head around, is that we have this Part 1A deficiency rate overall, which is 30-40%, depending on the size of the firm. And then what was it overall, like most recently? Does anyone know that off the top of their head?
I think I may have the numbers. All right. So Part 1 finding for 2024 were around 26%, and for 2023 were around 40%. That's including both risk-based and random inspections.
Gotcha. 40% in a year seems like a lot. I guess the reason that I'm bringing all this up is because, well, let me go back to the point I was trying to make. So we have the 4% actual restatement rate, and then we have the 40%, deficiency rate. And those Part 1A deficiencies are, like, the PCAOB defines them as so severe that the auditor should not have issued their opinion. And trying to reconcile those two numbers is difficult for me because they are so far apart. And so that's why, in many ways, I sympathize with the Republican legislators who have voted to eliminate the PCAOB, because an organization that consumes $400 million a year of resources from our economy through a tax on public companies ought to be able to justify its existence. And I feel like it has, like, let me challenge you with this question. Feel free to disagree with me as strongly as you like, but it seems to me that the PCAOB in 20 years has failed to accurately measure and report on audit quality, which is like its core mission should be to do that. If it if it wants to improve audit quality? Should it not measure and report on in a consistent way how auditors are doing?
I can weigh in on there are a few different aspects of what was said, right? So one is also just consider, just stepping, yes, their budget is $400 million, but consider the cost of a fraud. When Enron failed, it was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. When WorldCom failed, it was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. When FTX failed, just the investor losses, just the money that investors put in, primarily venture capitalists, was $12 billion, not to mention the money that customers have lost and employees.
Okay, that's a fair point.
So
Yeah.
That's one. The other is also, you think about the regulatory model that the PCAOB has. I think, like, I listened to the interview with board member Ho, and there are two ways to look at what the PCAOB does, right? One is that does the PCAOB's primary function to provide information to investors to assess audit quality, or is the role of the PCAOB, is the regulatory model to incentivize auditors to do a more thorough job of auditing clients? And let's go back to the example that you gave initially, right? With this audit professional whom you were speaking to about the PCAOB, and when they have the PCAOB overlooking what they're doing, then the incentive structure changes. Right? As Maureen said initially, the current structure is boards of audit committee members of boards. They are the ones who hire audit firms, but the ultimate consumer of audited financial statements are investors. But this creates this natural incentive conflict where auditors are answerable to the company whose financial statements they're auditing. Absent the PCAOB, that is the structure that's in place, right? So
Right.
to the extent the PCAOB serves a deterrence role and incentivizes auditors to do a more thorough job, I would argue that would be a more appropriate way or a different way of looking at how effective they are. Coming to your point about the inspection, the high inspection deficiency rates, and Maureen, please do weigh in a minute as well. But there are a few aspects of the deficiency rate that sort of gets lost. One is the areas of focus for inspections, they change from time to time. As there are certain current issues. So, for example, a few years ago, goodwill impairments were a big thing, and there was an area of focus. Prior to that, internal controls were a big area of focus, and the inspection process sort of focused on that. So when there are high deficiency rates, there are key areas that the inspectors are focusing on, and the deficiency rates stem from those specific areas. So it's not like, I keep looking at the exact same issue year after year after year, and the deficiency rate in those exact same areas stay high. The other part of that is, imagine if you're going to a doctor for a physical. There are two aspects, right? There are two outcomes to look at. One is what exactly is the doctor doing to check how healthy you are, what tests they're running, what exactly they're doing, and the other is the results of those tests. What ailments do you have? What do those test results reveal? Restatements are like the latter. They tell you what ailments that you have, right? But they do not give you a sense for how well did the auditor do their job performing the audit. And what the PCAOB is looking at is the former. So if I was going to evaluate the quality of health checkup based on the number of ailments the doctor found, then I would say that's not the right way to think of what the PCAOB deficiency rates are. I'll pause there. Maureen, please do.
Yeah, so I'll just go to the gap between the restatement rate and the deficiency rate. The restatement rate reflects the fact that a company has a material error in their financial statements that the auditor did not detect. And so one question is, what is that underlying level of material errors in the financial statements? How high is that? For you to get, say you've got a sample of audits that have 20% deficiencies, to have a restatement rate of 20%, you're kind of assuming every company has a material error and you know what, and the audits that don't have deficiencies push back on those errors, and the ones that did have deficiencies let them through. So it's like they are two different things. Restatements require an underlying material error on the financial statements coming from the company before the auditor does their work, and so they are fundamentally different metrics. And the fact that the overall restatement rate is so low at present, I think, is a positive sign on the deterrent effect that PCAOB inspections have had. When you go back to your initial comment about your conversation with the former partner, I think they were acknowledging the challenge in that relationship. One study that I think is particularly telling was done by Preeti Chowdhury, Ken Merkley, and Catherine Schipper on audit adjustments. And basically what they found is that by looking at inspections, they were able to access the frequency that an auditor proposes an adjustment and the frequency that the client accepts that adjustment. In a high fraction of audits, auditors are proposing adjustments and clients are turning them down. And when the clients waive more adjustments, there's a higher likelihood of restatements. So it's basically kind of going to that tension in the audit relationship between the client and the auditor. And the PCAOB's role is to come in and help by basically inspecting. So the auditor can say to the client, you know, I'd love to go with lower cost tests, but we're not going to meet the standard, and you know, and there's a risk that it would be inspected.
Right. It gives the auditor a good reason to push back. It gives the auditor strength, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way.
One other aspect of the deficiency rate is so it conducted a survey with one of my colleagues that conducted a survey of inspectors, not just PCAOB, but several different international audit regulators as well. And one of the questions was just to try and understand why is the deficiency rate high. Some of it is just that the auditors have not documented processes that they claim to have done. So this is not to minimize what the deficiency means, but if the auditors do not show proof of work, then how is the inspector supposed to accept that they perform the job?
Right. I see.
And some of the deficiency rate is just that, I mean, in all likelihood, the auditors probably did the job, but given
they didn't document it.
Yeah, they just didn't document it enough, and that has traditionally been a source of I want to say conflict between, at least from what I've observed, between auditors and the PCAOB. It does not minimize every deficiency, but the thing is, there are instances where it's just a documentation, where it is a documentation.
Yeah. Well, and I can totally sympathize with auditors or an audit partner who is confident that there is no issue with a particular matter in the audit and decides to sign off on it and skips doing the documentation. I mean, this happens all the time in the medical profession, right? Doctors are busy. They don't have time to chart everything out. And so if you come in and you expect them to have written down their thought process on everything they do, that's unrealistic. You know?
And it's great as long as there's no problem, right?
Right.
Even in the medical space, if something happens to the patient eventually, then I bet they wish.
Then it becomes an issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's okay. That helps me understand more this gap between the restatement rate and the deficiency rate. So, and I think this is something that is hard for the public to understand because it's hard for me as a CPA to understand it. Right? It is a very nuanced distinction. So the deficiency rate is a rate that is based on this hypothetical ideal of how to do an audit. And the PCAOB is coming in, inspecting an audit, and finding in many cases, in many audits, that something wasn't documented, something was not substantiated, and so therefore the audit opinion isn't supported, even though that opinion did not result in any financial restatement. So it's sort of like like
Just
looking
push back
back
to
with
the latter. We don't
Yeah.
know the latter, so we don't know the extent to which the inspection actually leads. And Daniel might be able to speak to this more. The extent to which how many restatements were triggered by an inspection. I don't think we know that. But perhaps Daniel can tell us.
Yeah, that part is a bit tricky to answer. I just wanted to because I agree with you. It's very difficult to understand, and assessing regulation effectiveness is always difficult because you don't know what you don't see. But perhaps an analogy could help, which is what I was trying to think about as I've been listening to this conversation. So one way to think about the PCAOB is, in a way, they're kind of a cop on the side of the road, and they're trying to prevent speeding. And so there's two things that could happen. So perhaps they never catch anyone because they are so visible that everybody makes sure they're slowing down when they're driving next to the cop. But does that mean the cop is not effective? Absolutely not. It's because the cop is there that you don't find any kind of issue to begin with.
And I want to point out that is something I think Nemit mentioned at the beginning of this interview, which is in 20 years, we have not had a major public company collapse like Enron, which is what we should remind everyone is the reason we have the PCAOB.
Right. So that's the deterrence effect of the PCAOB. And then they have a second effect, which is more about detection. When somebody is speeding, they're going to catch that person speeding. I like the analogy because at the end of the day, is speeding really bad for society and everything? Well, if somebody speeds and everything's okay, perhaps nothing's going to happen. But the problem is that it's a risk of accident for the person who's speeding and for others who are on the same road. So in my mind, I mean, the restatement rate is the accidents that occur. The speeding is the issues that are done by the auditor. And the PCAOB is pretty much the cop on the side of the road. I think that provides an analogy. If you don't get speeding, it's not that the PCAOB is not doing their job. It's actually they're doing their job so well that everybody is going to make sure they don't speed. If there's still some speeding detected, well, there's a question eventually of why the PCAOB, why people still speed. One reason could be, as Nemit mentioned, is that the PCAOB changes the location where they're going to be looking at potential speeding. So that's essentially the focus areas, that's the risk-based type of inspection, that's also randomization, where there's some unpredictability about where the PCAOB is going to look at. But eventually, we don't have as many accidents as there are people who are speeding, thank goodness. And that's essentially the difference between restatement and PCAOB Part 1 finding.
Maureen, what about your research? You focused on earnings management, financial reporting quality. What does your research say about audit oversight and how that's changed since the PCAOB was created?
So, I mean, there's my own work, and there's the work of many others who have looked at the relationship between accounting quality, reporting quality, and capital market effects. I'll mention one set of studies. It kind of ties into other topics about, how helpful are, audited financial statements to investors. A study I've been involved in looks at the extent to which investors respond to the information when earnings are announced. And essentially what the finding is that since the early 2000s, the magnitude of that response has increased very significantly. Some studies have looked very carefully around the implementation of PCAOB inspections sort of before and after for firms that got them or didn't. And there as well, there's sort of evidence that investors view the information in terms of their incorporation of the information into price and reflecting it in sort of their valuations as more credible. And so one factor in the research is that there's just a very significant increase in how investors are relying on accounting information. It is a major source of information for valuation. So that's why all of this is so vital. If investors didn't use financial statements to value companies, this would be much less significant. But because their PCAOB is regulating $50 trillion worth of U.S. equities or listed equities, sort of the fact that investors are relying on the financial statements, relying on earnings announcements, means it's very important that there's a lot of credibility behind those. And for sure, the evidence supports increasing use of that information. It's not irrelevant, despite the fact that we've got increasingly a knowledge economy with many intangibles not completely on the books. But basically, overall, the evidence suggests that the financial statements are increasingly informative, and that the quality has improved through the implementation of SOX and PCAOB inspections.
Let's assume that this bill passes and the PCAOB is eliminated. What happens at the SEC? Does the SEC have the capabilities to replicate what the PCAOB is doing?
From what I know right now is they're not clear in terms of there's no additional, as far as what I understand, there's no additional budget that the SEC is going to receive to absorb the PCAOB. So then it's the bill is currently vague about what will happen, except for saying that the functions will be absorbed by the SEC. Now, why would this be difficult? Because let's say the SEC could basically do everything that the PCAOB does. What would still be a constraint? Well, a few things. So the structure of the PCAOB as a non-profit gives it a few benefits. One is the PCAOB can pay higher salaries than what the SEC can, because the SEC is subject to government salary caps. And this allows the PCAOB to attract certain talent that's harder to do in the SEC, unless people are coming into the SEC as high-level talent is coming in with the hopes of rotating out, eventually going back to the private sector. So that is one potential weakness. The other is over the past 2 decades, the PCAOB has entered into several MOUs with foreign governments to allow the PCAOB to inspect the work of foreign auditors who audit clients or participate in the audits of clients that are listed in U.S. capital markets. All those agreements were done on the basis of the PCAOB being a non-profit entity that's not a U.S. government agency. Importantly, particularly the one with the People's Republic of China. And if PCAOB is subsumed by the SEC, then that agreement will not stand any longer, and it's unlikely that the SEC will be able to renegotiate this agreement. And another sort of subtle point is again, the PCAOB's model works based on deterrence. We've spoken about Part 1 findings, but they also have something called Part 2 findings. So if auditors resolve the issues related to quality control that the PCAOB inspectors raise, then the PCAOB will not publicly disclose those Part 2 findings. And this is supposed to give auditors incentives to address these issues. And the publicly available data suggests that auditors very frequently address the issues raised by the PCAOB. So if the PCAOB is subsumed by the SEC, then it would be subject to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, which the PCAOB is not subject to. And so the current model that the PCAOB has of deterrence would again have to change. So, in theory, it feels like a lot of the current structure would have to change if the PCAOB goes back to the SEC, and none of those details are laid out. In fact, what it seems like is we'll just be going back to a system of pre-Enron.
So I take it that you are in favor, Nemit, of keeping the PCAOB.
Yeah, for a variety of reasons. I listened to the interview that you had with the discussion you had with board member Ho, and she raises many very reasonable points. So there could the PCAOB could they do things more effectively? Could they improve their processes? Without doubt, of course. But is the current proposal in the House that's there in this big beautiful bill, does that seem like a step forward? From at least everything that I've heard and seen, it doesn't seem like.
Daniel, I don't think I've directly asked you that question, so I'm going to give that one to you as well. Should the PCAOB be preserved?
I believe so, yes. And I concur with what Nemit mentioned. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. I mean, and I agree with everything what Nemit said. So I think the Freedom of Information Act is one of the crucial difference between the PCAOB and the SEC. So from a researcher standpoint, actually, if the PCAOB were to be folded into the SEC, I would send a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, so I get all the information that the SEC is doing in terms of inspecting the audit firms. But keep in mind that the audit firms are aware of that. And so how would they cooperate with the SEC in the same way as they can with the PCAOB, knowing that whatever they are giving to the SEC could be FOIA'd by somebody like me? And that's where things would get very tricky. And I suspect lawyers would get involved very quickly, and those inspections would become extremely adversarial in nature, which was not meant to be the purpose of this inspection. The aim of these inspections is for the PCAOB to come in and understand what went well and what didn't go so well. And without thinking about interference from others who may look at the work papers or lawyers being involved and everything, all of that would go away. So that's one of the issues that I'm having right now with the current proposal. Something else also which hasn't been considered enough, I think, is Congress, when they passed Sarbanes-Oxley, were very concerned about potential regulatory capture of the new regulator. So regulatory capture is when a regulatory entity gets captured by the regulated entities. And it happens because regulated entities have a very strong stake into making sure that the regulator is not too harsh to them. However, the rest of the public doesn't have as much incentives to monitor the regulator carefully, and therefore, usually the regulator can end up being captured by the regulated entities. So to prevent this from happening, SOX made sure that out of the 5 board members at the PCAOB, 2 would have expertise, they would be CPAs, but 3 would not have CPAs, to preserve a mix between expertise and independence of the entity. Now, if the PCAOB were to be folded into the SEC, would they become under the Office of the Chief Accountant, who's typically an audit partner who's only from the firm and is going to supervise the PCAOB? It feels like things would go back very much like the peer review system before, if people at the SEC end up being a little bit more captured, I would say, than people at the PCAOB. So for those reasons, I think the PCAOB should hopefully remain independent.
Maureen, you expressed your point of view on this earlier. Is there anything you'd like to add as we close out?
For sure, I think eliminating the PCAOB would risk the trust that we have in our capital markets, and the fact that it allows companies to raise capital, create jobs at a low cost, and that we are the envy of the world. The trust that people have in our capital markets really does depend upon the quality of the audited financial statements, and eroding that at a time when crypto is coming online. AI is posing all kinds of fascinating opportunities, but for sure significant challenges. Private investments are being proposed to be, made available to individual investors, and all of these things, I think, say, it's not like the work is done and we can hand it over to somebody, who just, capitalizes on that. The work will be always there and evolving, and you need the seasoned expertise, the independent regulation, the magnitude of the budget of 2% relative to, say, $19 billion of audit fees. It's like 2%, the $400 million, 2% of what we pay auditors to audit these companies, and dwarfed by the, an epsilon loss of confidence. And when confidence is lost, it does not come back. It is very hard to build that back.
Maureen, thank you again for helping to set this up. I learned a lot. I have been speaking with Maureen McNichols from Stanford, Nemit Shroff of MIT, and Daniel Aobdia of Penn State. Thank you all so much for your time and your insights on this really important and critical issue facing the profession.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.